Good evening, I'm Sister Julia Marie. I'm going to be with you this evening for this opening session for the School of Lectio. I will be back home in a couple of days, and I'd be glad to answer questions at that time. And then I know Sister Barbara and some of the other teachers in the school will be able to answer any questions that I leave open-ended here this evening. In your folder, you've got a couple of handouts. The first one I want to direct your attention to is a bibliography. It's an annotated bibliography on the early monastic sources. As I go through the presentation this evening, I'm going to show you some of these books, and then you can take a look at them. Most of them are in our library here at the monastery, and like I said, I'm happy to answer any questions about those when I get back. The other handout you've got is a two-sided handout. On one side, you have a map, and it's a map of the Mediterranean, which I'm going to do a little rough sketch of up here. But if you take a look at it, it's got on it the critical locations that we're going to be talking about this evening. And so it might just help you as we go through this material to take a look at that map rather than try to interpret what I'm going to draw up here for you. And the other side of it is a modified version of a timeline that was done by my professor, Columbus Stewart. If you take a look at the timeline, you're going to see that it has people down the left-hand side, and then it has their writings. It has these lines that come across. I'm going to show you how to interpret that. So the way you look at this is Origen, his life is 185 to 254. And so you have a line that roughly approximates his lifetime. Then, if you look at the next one, Anthony, Pachomius, and Athanasius. I'm going to talk primarily about Anthony and Pachomius. Look at the overlap on their lifespan. Then you have a wonderful character named Evagrius Ponticus, and you see his life. You see the lines of these people that are all contemporaries: St. Basil, St. Jerome, and then a little later, Augustine, John Cassian, and then much later, St. Benedict. Down at the bottom, you have their writings. So you can match up Athanasius, who wrote the life of Anthony, and you can see his time period as well as the time period of Anthony. So I think it's a helpful little guide to see the time period and the writings of these critical figures. So what I'm going to do with you tonight is the narrative of late antiquity. I'm a history teacher, and so I think in terms of when did this happen and why was it significant. So when you go through the school in these next few days, you're going to be given a lot of teaching that you may not be familiar with. And for me, as a history teacher, to know the background of where it came from is extremely important. And what I think is helpful is for you to understand that what we're sharing with you over these period of days comes from a very long tradition and a very solid foundation. The life we lead as Benedictines is over 1,500 years old. That's a pretty good track record. And I always tell my students that Benedictines are the oldest institution in the Western world, except for the Catholic Church. And what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening, and then the teaching over these next few days, is the foundation that's under that 1500 years. So when St. Benedict writes the rule that we live by, he's resting it on the foundation of these characters we're going to talk about. So the narrative of late antiquity. So where do we start? We start with Jesus. And so he is always the beginning point. We have the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and the experience of Jesus that was the experience that was had by his apostles, his followers, the crowds that heard him, the people he healed. So we start there. And then after Jesus, what's the first layer? Okay, so the first layer is comes with the writing of Scripture. Well, we don't just set out and have the text of the Scripture automatically. The first thing that happens is we have what we would call oral tradition. So what's the oral tradition? These are the stories. This is what we see comes into the writing of the Gospels. So someone tells a story about this preacher that they heard. And he talked about the blessedness of people who are poor in spirit. Or somebody tells the story that they were there at this wedding and this rabbi came with a crowd of followers. And so there's this experience of Jesus, and then the stories are passed around. And eventually, you've got things being written. For a long time, it's just passed around. But then you have things being written, not sit down and write a gospel, but we have written fragments. So we have the oral tradition, and then you have written fragments. Pieces of stories, pieces of the teaching, and then eventually those are gathered together into what become known as the Gospels. Okay? So that's our first layer. Now, in looking at the second layer, you might want to take a look at your map. So the second layer are these people who read the Gospels, who read St. Paul, who heard these writings in worship, and then they go out and they try to live it. They're trying to live the teaching. So if you look at your handout of people and places, the first person, the first really prominent character that we know about is Antony. Antony the Desert. He lives a very long life from 251 to 356. We know about Antony because of the biography that Athanasius wrote. Athanasius was his bishop. Athanasius lived in Alexandria. And so he writes this book, The Life of Antony. In the ancient world, ancient Christian world, this was the equivalent of a New York Times bestseller. Everybody read it. This is a translation that is published by Paulus Press, this series of the classics of Western spirituality. When a woman enters our community, the first thing that we study together in looking at monastic history is the life of Antony. And what those sisters tell me as they prepare for their final commitment, that what was most helpful to them was Antony. His teaching is clear. This is very readable. I encourage you to take a look at this because it's just brilliant. Anthony goes out into the deserts in Egypt, and he has to deal with his own afflictions. And tomorrow you're going to be spending an entire day with Father Jack and Sharon Hanisch looking at the teaching on the afflictions that we begin to see unfold in the life of Antony the Great. So take a look at him. Let me show you, let me do a little map here for you. So, this is the Nile River. This is the Mediterranean. This is the Sinai Peninsula. The Red Sea is here. And then we get the Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Jordan, the areas where Jesus lived. So where is Antony? So Antony was living in a village in Egypt, and his conversion is interesting because he goes to church and he hears the gospel that says, leave everything and come follow me. And he goes out and he does it. He sells everything. He had a younger sister that he was responsible for, and he sells all those possessions. He takes a little bit to hold on for his sister, and he begins to live a more dedicated Christian life. And then he goes back to church and he hears it said, here's the reading, have no anxiety about tomorrow. And so then he gets rid of the rest of the possessions. He takes his sister puts her into the care of a group of holy women. And then he goes off into the desert to live. Now, in Egypt, Egyptian civilization was made because of the Nile. So what you need to understand about Egypt is that because of the flooding of the Nile, there is a band of green, a band of vegetation on either side of the Nile. And then it stops abruptly. If you look at an aerial view of the Nile, there is not a tapered changing of the vegetation like we see when we fly from this part of the United States west. It's not tapered, it's abrupt. There's vegetation and then there's no vegetation. And Antony goes out beyond the area of vegetation. And this was known as the region of death. And they literally that's where they buried people, out in the desert, away from the arable land. Well, when Antony goes out there, he begins a turf battle with the demon. And he tells this account to Athanasius, who writes it down. And then from that, we get the principles of this early Christian teaching on how we deal with our own thoughts. Because when Antony goes out to the desert, he's still preoccupied with the care of his sister in his mind, or he's still thinking about the way he used to live. And he has to learn to detach from those concerns. So that's what we see with Anthony. The next person we have is Pachomius, Pachomius, Pachomius. And Pachomius, he's in Egypt also, but Pachomius was a pagan. He was serving as a soldier. He must not have been very good at it because he was captured. And when he was captured, he was put in prison, and local Christians came to minister to the men who were imprisoned. And the example of their service and their love for one another converted Pachomius, and Pachomius then becomes a monk. So you have his dates on that sheet. So Pachomius becomes a monk, and while Antony lives as a hermit, so Antony is the hermit, or what we say, eremite. Pachomius begins a common life, and we would say he is a Cenobite, or we talk about Cenobitic. Monasticism. That's what we live. We are not hermits. We are Cenobites. So what happens is Pachomius goes out, and if you're going to support a community, you cannot be out in the middle of the desert because you can't feed folks out there, not large groups. So Pachomius, he settles in that band of green along the Nile, and he starts a monastery there. He wrote a rule for monks. This volume, we have a couple of the volumes in the library. Volume 1 is the history of Pachomius, his life, and then there are also the rules in another volume in the library, the Pachomian rules. There are actually 3 volumes in this set, and I think we have 2 of them. So Pachomius then is the founder of Cenobitic monasticism. He starts 12 monasteries up and down the Nile River, and there were 10 of men and 2 of women. One thing that happened because of the Nile is the current flows north. The current flows north towards the Mediterranean. And so when you read Pachomian material, there's constant references to the river and the boats. And it's what's happening is Pachomius is visiting the different monasteries. And so he would get in the boat in the river with the sail down and go north. The prevailing wind that comes off the Mediterranean blows south. And so he would get in the boat in the river, put the sail up, and the prevailing wind would carry the boat against the current of the river. And that's why Pachomian monasticism is in a stretch up and down that river. This reality is why Egyptian civilization developed as it did. So these are your first 2 really key figures. And then after that, after these 2, you begin to get a flowering of monastic life. And it happens in Syria. You might want to look back at your map. It happens in Syria. It happens in Palestine. It happens in Egypt, and it happens in Cappadocia. If you look at number 3 on your map, the map's not great, but you can see the small name there between Nissa. You'll see above Nissa, Cappadocia, Cappadocia. That is the area where St. Basil was. Constantinople, you know, was the great city where Istanbul is. That's the center of the Eastern Christian Church. And then you see in that area of modern day Turkey where monastic life really began to flourish. The next characters that come up, this is all in that second layer. The next people who come up are men and women who were following the example of Antony, and they go out into the desert to live the Christian life in a way very similar to what Anthony does. These are, we often call them the elders of the desert. Elders of the desert. They're also called, in some texts, they are referred to as Amas. Excuse me, that's Amas and Abbas. The Egyptian term is Appa. Appa. That's an A. Ooh, that's scary. Let me fix that. Abbas. That's Coptic, the early Egyptian language. So these folks are out in the deserts, and from them we get wonderful, wonderful teaching. And there are many of their stories. So let me show you. The way these are referred to is, you're going to love this, it's a 50-cent word. These are the apathigmata, which are the lives or the stories of the desert elders. So there are different ones. This is called Sayings of the Desert Fathers. It's what we call an alphabetical collection, which is exactly what it sounds like. The authors are, the elders are in here just by alphabetical names. This is daily readings with the Desert Fathers. You would have one story for every day of the year. This is the life of Blessed Syncletica. This is one of the desert women. Not surprisingly, we have fewer of their accounts than we have of the men, but I would say in the last 20 years, more of the women's stories have been published. This is the world of the Desert Fathers. And this one is the wisdom of the Desert Fathers. These are in our library. These are the Syrian traditions. So they're not as well known. They are translated from the ancient Syriac, but they're delightful, really wonderful. In the library, there are many more. These are just the ones that I have, but there are many more in there. This one is my favorite. This book is called Desert Wisdom, Sayings from the Desert Father. What I love about this book is that it is accompanied with wonderful Japanese style calligraphy drawings. So you get the story and you get the short little story and then the drawing, which is just wonderful. So let me show you one. Here we go. Here's one. It was said of Abba Agathon that for 3 years he carried a pebble around in his mouth until he learned to be silent. And you can see the Abba here sitting there, and he's he's got this pebble in his mouth. So let's look at this story. I mean, this is very characteristic of the desert stories. So what is this about putting a rock in your mouth? I mean, in a way, it doesn't make any sense. But you have to think about this. Think about what Jesus said about things that are unclean that come out of our mouths. When I voice judgment, when I voice harsh criticism, when I voice jealousy or anger, which are those afflictions that are inside me. And I can unleash this kind of thing without any thought or reflection about the effect it's going to have on someone else. So what the story is saying is that Abba Agathon puts the rock in his mouth to discipline himself about his speech. Because if you think about it, if you've got a little pebble in your mouth, a couple of things. Number one, it's going to be important not to bite down on it really hard because you're going to crack your teeth. The second thing is, and probably worse, is if you're not careful, you're going to suck that rock down over your windpipe. And I think this is what the teaching is saying. We should be as careful about our words, as mindful in our speech as we would be if we were scared of biting down on the rock and breaking our teeth or sucking the pebble down over our windpipe. And so the suggestion here from Agathon and from me is not that you all go out and pick up a rock and put it in your mouth. It's that you reflect on your speech. Would I say this if I was worried that I'd suck the pebble down my throat? So this is very characteristic of the stories. It looks like a very simple little teaching, but when you begin to unpack it and reflect on it, and then more importantly, apply it in your daily life, you begin to see the deeper meaning and the challenge. Spiritually, we could go a long time working on just that one little lesson, just that one. And it stays in your mind, and that was the point. That's why these Abbas told these stories to their followers. Okay, so let's move on. The third layer is the alphabetical collections. Some of these desert elders became very well known. Poimen, for instance, is very well known. A lot of stories about him or from his teaching. The alphabetical collection, which I showed you, that one book. And the next is the anonymous collections. And if you look at the editor references on this book, most of them will tell you if they're alphabetical or what they are. The fourth layer is the systematic material. This is a big step. And the main figure we need to thank for this is Evagrius Ponticus, which is a great name. That's an I. Okay, so Evagrius Ponticus. What happens is Evagrius takes the material, and in reflecting on it, he begins to pull it together in themes. So he's looking at the teaching of Anthony. He's looking at the stories from the desert. He's looking at Pachomius. And what he's doing really is analyzing that spiritual journey. And then he begins to look at this and say, okay, so one of the afflictions has to do with food. And one of the afflictions has to do with sex. And in looking at that, he says this arises from the body. And then he looks at anger, the affliction of anger. And he's like, well, that doesn't come from the body. Where does that come? And in reflecting on that, he sees that anger is the affliction that comes from our mind. But pride doesn't come from the body, and it doesn't come from the mind. That's really an affliction of the soul. So he's the one who really organizes this material, systematizes it, so that why is it a big jump? Because in teaching then, you have a way that it's organized to present. In teaching, you can listen to the affliction of anger or depression and realize that where you need to go is looking at the thoughts, what the person is thinking about, or what they're stewing about, or past hurts, or what is occupying their mind. So this is Evagrius. This volume is the Practicos and the chapters on prayer. So Evagrius does give suggestions about what to do when you're afflicted by certain temptations. So this is a critical step. There's also he gathered material around other themes such as forgiveness or these chapters on prayer. So that's a big transition. The fifth layer are the histories and lives. This book